Hello, everyone. This is Michael Tierra at the East-West School of Herbal Medicine, and I got the honor to have Todd Caldecott, who's got his own school in Toronto, isn't it, Todd?
British Columbia.
British Columbia,
Opposite coast. Yeah.
opposite coast. Okay, I've been many times to British Columbia. I studied there myself with Norma Myers many years ago.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's probably in Vancouver, and I'm up the coast in a little small town called Powell River.
Right. So Todd is the director of a school which he founded called the Dogwood School of Botanical Medicine. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the other things that I've been able to pick up, I had a very crazy morning, by the way. So
no worries.
So the other things I've been able to pick up about your bio is, of course, you're the author of a fabulous book on Ayurvedic medicine. I presume everybody can see this. I highly recommend it. And I highly recommended it because I also wrote the foreword. I wouldn't have written the foreword if I didn't recommend it.
Right.
And so it's a great book.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's a bit old now. I mean, that was like what, 2004, 2005 it was published, and obviously it's many years later, and so my own knowledge and experience is accumulated significantly. And actually, I have another text. I use it in my my course in Ayurveda, and it's about double the size of that one. And
are you selling that also?
I'm not quite there yet. I just have it available as course material for my students, but that's the next step, is to publish it as a hardcover and then offer that to the general public. But it definitely expands upon the content, especially on the therapeutic side.
Right.
Yeah. So,
well, of course, Ayurveda is older than all of us by far.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're always learning. We're always discovering new things, and there's it's such a rich tradition. There's so much to uncover.
Oh, right.
And I admit I'm a little bit of a disadvantage, maybe a lot disadvantaged, because of course I'm not Indian.
Right.
My grasp of Sanskrit is limited. I can read Devanagari very, very slowly. So it's I'm sort of coming at it as a foreigner in some respects, but the essential teachings and structure of Ayurveda are really universal and are actually very simple. So we can get lost in the complexity, and of course that's sometimes what we do as practitioners and researchers. People have more of an academic bent. We kind of delve into the material, but on a clinical basis, the principles that I employ are pretty simple, and it's so nice to have a simple model to come back to. Simple doesn't mean simplistic, but because we're dealing with a world that is so complex and increasingly more complex with so much disparate pieces of information, that it's really nice to have a system that allows us to kind of understand all these different facets and kind of organize them in our brains in a simple way, so that we can make practical suggestions. Because that's, I think sometimes it happens to students, people that are just recently graduated from a program, is their head is filled with so much information. It's hard to kind of distill that down into some basic principles that will just hold them in good stead. And I know you've been an advocate of that as well.
Very much. And it's not only reading the material and learning it, but actually digesting it.
Yeah, right. And you got to do that in small bites, right? Like,
and I find that going back to the basics has never been a fruitless process for me. Every time I go back to the basics, I always understand another level of Ayurveda and Chinese medicine as well. Now, I understand that you made your specialty Ayurvedic medicine, but truly, I regard you as a planetary herbalist, because you have a consummate understanding of Chinese medicine, as I've been able to understand, and a great advocate and user of Western herbal medicine. So we're basically Western herbalists practicing Ayurveda and Chinese medicine.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a reflection of where we live on the west coast of North America. We're at the confluence of all these different cultural traditions, the expansion of the West, and then the merging of the East. And and also you and I might not have the same kind of grounding within a specific cultural context. So I think that's kind of the cool thing about being a West Coaster, is just that we're at the confluence of all these different traditions, and it allows us the opportunity to be maybe a little eclectic in how we approach things. But I definitely advocate for that kind of planetary approach. We live on this shared planet. We eat food that's from all different parts of the world. Our genetic makeup is, comprised, and we share this ancestry with everyone in the world. So why not? It seems to make sense to me.
I think of us as being part of an evolution of a planetary herbology. In other words, all these concepts, basically, they're all saying the same thing with different cultural biases and different semantics. And that becomes a barrier to some people who are locked into one system, like, for instance, Ayurveda or even Chinese medicine. They get locked into those systems, and it doesn't allow them to use herbs that are all around them, which I know you use abundantly and have a deep insight of as well as I do. At least I keep trying to get deeper into it. So the idea of integrating Ayurveda with other systems of herbal medicine, can you tell a little bit about your experience with Chinese and or Western herbs, how you integrate these things into your practice of Ayurveda or into your understanding of teaching it?
Sure. Maybe I can just provide a little bit of context for that. So I originally was a film and television actor. That's when I graduated from high school, as already with an agent, and was doing film and television, and got kind of bored with that. And
by the way, Todd is the best looking of all the herbalists that you'll ever meet.
That's a good thing, isn't it? Yeah. I haven't capitalized on that as much as I probably could. So,
he's a great guy.
I left off, I kind of did the thing where, you're a young man, I sold all my stuff and I went to India, and I spent a year traveling around India and West Asia. And I ended up getting really sick, of course, because I was trying to survive on just, a few bucks a day. And, I looked at people in India and I was like, well, gosh, they're just surviving on cents every day. And so I should be able to do it. And, just a little bit more. And of course, got really sick doing that. And, still continued to travel around. And when I finally came back to Canada, I was suffering from a chronic digestive disorder. Basically, it was just chronic dysentery. And I sought out the help of a number of different practitioners, naturopaths, conventional medical doctors, Chinese herbalist. And it wasn't until I met a physician who later became one of my teachers, Dr. Sukumaran, who just kind of gave me such practical treatment. He was the first practitioner that sat down with me and told me like what I should eat, when I should eat it. He prescribed some really simple medicines for me. They were simple formulas like Hingustok, for example. And it didn't take long. It took maybe 4 to 6 weeks, and I was pretty much back to normal. And I was so inspired, I began to study with him, but I only could study with him to a certain extent. I really wanted to study Ayurveda, but a little ironic that I had gone to India where there was lots of Ayurveda, and I was ignorant of it there for the most part, got really sick in India, and then came back to Canada only to discover Ayurveda. But there was no place to study. But at that time, there was a new school opening up called the Coastal Mountain College. It's now the Boucher Institute of Naturopathic Medicine. And I began my studies there as a Western medical herbalist. So the dean of the college, one of my esteemed teachers was Chanchal Cabrera, who's a British medical herbalist.
Oh.
And so
I'm going to interview her also at some point.
Oh yeah, she's great. She's
great herbalist.
Just writing a book right now on cancer, and she's a master gardener. She's got so many skills, right, and so much knowledge, but very much from a sort of a Western scientific bent. Yeah, I remember we would debate in class because I was so infatuated with the system of Ayurveda that I just couldn't like parse together like all of the bits of the information in terms of the scientific approach to herbal medicine. It right. seemed to me it lacked kind of an inherent basis to really understand and apply any kind of principle. So, I took from that all that wonderful information. There was also some Chinese medicine we studied, and I continued studying with one of my teachers, Dr. Sukumaran, and kind of integrated that approach, definitely rooted in the Western herbal tradition, but I always understood that through the lens of Ayurveda. That's how it made sense to me. And then when I went to India to do some postgraduate study at a hospital there, it just further helped me deepen my awareness of Ayurveda and how to apply those principles. But of course, when I came back to Canada after that trip, I was living in the West Kootenays of British Columbia, and Ayurveda and India were very far away. And at that time, it was very difficult to get Indian herbs, and certainly, Indian formulas were just, it wasn't practical. So it's a little better now, but even still, it's not that easy. So I really did need to pull upon the traditions of Chinese medicine and Western herbal medicine and start working with the local flora, start working with wild plant medicines. Once again, integrating it into my practice through the lens of Ayurveda. So that's, I think, probably one of my specialties, is trying to integrate this amazing knowledge into a Western context.
Herbs coming from all over the world right now. And, and if you were a good Ayurvedic doctor, a good Chinese doctor, you would not want to ignore some of the herbs that come from places that just because they're not available at your local place, in local area. And so Ayurveda, India is a broad, large continent and has herbs from a diverse climate and seasonal areas. So there's a wide variety of herbs there. I didn't talk too much here, but you mentioned a couple things that I will bring up later on, like Hingish stock and its use, and the use of hing, which is asafoetida, which is sometimes called devil's dung.
Yeah, for good reason.
I have a big hunk of it in my office, and I keep it in a jar, and I hesitate to ever open the jar because the aroma comes out, and it definitely smells like devil's dung.
Yeah, I remember buying some when I was in Nepal. Of course, it's harvested in Afghanistan, so they had obtained it. And I bought it and wrapped it up in I think about 10 different layers of plastic, and I had it in my room at night. And I couldn't sleep because it kept waking me up. It was just the odor would just permeate, and I started to fall asleep, and there'd be this smell. So I finally had to get up and remove it from the room and put it into another room. So it's a very powerful odor.
I think there's something about the odors of those herbs and the strength that they represent, the volatile qualities, that make it specifically very effective for digestion.
Oh yeah, well, it sort of encompasses all the sulfurous properties of digestion. When you're digesting and you burp and you have that kind of taste, a hot, spicy, sulfurous flavor. Hing just encapsulates those qualities.
So when you would use hing as an example, how much would you actually use? I'm told you take just basically a pinch of it.
Well, there's two different forms typically you would find. You would get the compounded asafoetida, which is the ground up hing resin that has been mixed with gum arabic or wheat flour, and usually has some coloring in it. That's the culinary source. That's usually what people get. That one you can usually use a fair amount of, because number one, it's been ground into a powder, it's been left to oxidize, it's diluted, so it's not quite as strong. So, if I was preparing a meal, I might use even an eighth or a quarter teaspoon of that. But of the actual hing itself, the hing resin, it sort of depends on the quality of the hing and how long you've had it, but it's really just a tiny amount, smaller than a lentil size, really, but about that maybe. You grind that up with different herbs and spices and put that in the pan with ghee or some kind of fat. Hing is one of those herbs that Ayurveda says has to undergo this purification process, literally mardana, which means to murder it, because it's such mardana, to murder it, because it's so it's so intense, it's so volatile, it's got a life of its own. So in order to use it, you have to process it in this way and kill it in that regard.
And I have a piece that's about that big.
Well, that's probably several lifetimes of it.
That's what I would think. I never use it because of that reason.
You're probably the local hing king. I imagine you could make some money there selling some hing on the side.
So how do you I didn't want to get off topic here. The basic topic that I'm trying to get from you, because I know you're really expert at these kinds of things, which is integrating. How would you integrate Ayurvedic and Chinese and Western herbs, like for specific treatments, you can name whichever one comes to mind, that where you might be using herbs from these different cultures and traditions simultaneously.
Well, as you said, I mean, what separates a system like Ayurveda from Chinese medicine or any of the other, indigenous energetic traditions? It's mostly just semantics, because when it gets right down to it, the actual concepts in terms of the energetic concepts are really similar, if not identical. Just, what is the impediment is just understanding it within that cultural context, getting past the language barriers. But, you and I both studied the physiomedical eclectic tradition and that of Samuel Thompson. And I've argued many times that the system that Samuel Thompson came up with, his system of cures, is remarkably similar to the Ayurveda Panchakarma system. The whole process, the whole idea of giving like an emetic to purge the canker from the body.
Right.
That's Vamana. That's the first step of Panchakarma.
Right.
Now, the difference between Thompsonian medicine and Ayurveda Panchakarma is that you've got thousands of years of practice and empirical evidence, a very refined clinical approach and strategies with indications and contraindications, whereas Thompson didn't have all that stuff. It was much more crude in many respects. The repertoire of different botanicals was much less. The clearly defined clinical states for indications and or contraindications wasn't as well articulated. But in essence, it is the same system.
It is.
And likewise, I mean, so Chinese medicine doesn't have anything exactly like that. I mean, I'm not aware of this sort of system of purification, where you might call it more of a heroic form of treatment.
Yeah, I've always thought that Ayurveda is closest to Western herbal medicine in its emphasis on purification and diet, whereas Chinese medicine theoretically, and I'm saying theoretically with a capital T, can exist without the idea that of purification and diet as a major factor. Of course, we know that it is, and I advocate that. But
well, I mean, as far as I know, Chinese medicine has an amazing approach to food therapy. I mean, it's part of the folkloric tradition there as well. It's maybe a little different from how Ayurveda approaches it, but yeah, I mean, of course, I think Chinese medicine has a really good command of how different foods affect the body and how you can use them therapeutically. Like eating chicken gizzards to deal with stones in the body.
Scorpions and centipedes and all that stuff.
Right. Okay. I'm not much an intentional insectivore, but have never been able to get my patients to embrace that enthusiastically. But yeah, absolutely.
If you buy the granules of it, nobody knows.
No one's the wiser. There you go.
The scorpions work really well for mental problems, for the brain, healing the brain, and for things like epilepsy and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
I've used it a lot in my clinic, and there's a place for those things, but the Chinese, they say that they'll eat everything and anything.
That's kind of true, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, even just look at the issue of fungus. Like I find generally cultures are either fungophobes or fungophiles.
Right.
And in China, they're definitely fungophiles, but you go across the Himalayas and into India, at least with mainstream conventional Hindu Indian society, they're fungophobes. The tribal peoples definitely eat fungus. These are the indigenous peoples of India that sort of exist on the outside the mainstream culture.
But when you say funguses, what are you referring to? Mushroom?
Any mushroom. I mean,
I didn't know that about Ayurveda.
Yeah, like if you look in the classical texts of Ayurveda, there's no reference to the use of mushrooms. I mean, there may be in some cases as a food, but in terms of like clinical usage, like you would find in Chinese medicine, there's really nothing there. And partly it's because this, it's hard to know how these things develop, but India underwent like 1,000 years of invasion and cultural constriction, where a lot of the values became very crystallized, and some very hard ideas around like what is pure, what is impure. And one notion was that that because fungi thrive on decaying and dead materials, that they impart that property to the body. Therefore, if you eat them, you're sort of imbibing in that dark quality.
So to be clear, because I think I messed up the focus here, Ayurveda doesn't put much of an emphasis on eating funguses.
I have not seen that. I have not seen it. And I think it's, as India changes, you'll find there's more acceptance to eating mushrooms. Where you find mushrooms still being consumed is actually among the indigenous tribal peoples of India. And there's actually some speculation that maybe the original soma mentioned in the Vedas was maybe derived in part or wholly from some fungus species like a psilocybe, like a magic mushroom, perhaps, or that in a combination of other species.
Right. Yeah. My travels in India, I'll never forget when I went there. I had an introduction to Ayurveda from my spiritual teacher, Baba Haridas.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize when he was talking to me about herbs when I sat at the foot of his bed that he was actually teaching me Ayurveda until many years afterwards. And but he told me about different herbs and so forth. He told me about Brahmi, and at that time everybody thought Goda Kola was Brahmi, and it is. But he said there's another Brahmi which is stronger.
Yeah.
So I went on a search for that, and I went on a search for other things in India related to Ayurveda that I got from him. And I was in southern India, and I went to the College of Ayurveda in southern India, and I figured if I really wanted to find out about the tradition of Ayurveda, I should ask them if they teach pulse diagnosis.
Right.
And it was really interesting that in that college in southern India, they said they don't teach it. And then the guy was sweet. He apologized to me, but he said my teacher teaches it. And he sent me on this miraculous journey to India kind of thing, where you go take one of those taxi types of things all the way out to the countryside. And I walked into this guy's. I knocked on his door. It was a big campus there, and it was empty. And I knocked on his door, and this wife answers the door, and I said, "Well, I came here to ask him about Ayurveda. I want anything I can learn from him." I was completely a novice, so I walked in. And he very cordially sat me in his desk, and he said, "Well, what is it that you know?" And so I told him some of the things that I thought I knew, and he just started from there. And every single thing that he said was backed up by a Sanskrit sloka.
Sloka, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I realized that in the East we consider that if somebody has a college degree, a PhD, that is a testament to their authority. In India, it's if you can always quote the sources of everything that you're going to teach directly from the scriptures, and people would get with a teacher like that and memorize one of those entire texts. That would be basically what their teaching was. And he said he closed his school because the government started regulating how Ayurveda needed to be taught, and he said it couldn't be taught that way, and so he closed his school down as a result of that. Again, it's a long little story on my part, but I just thought I'd interject that. It was interesting to me.
Yeah, that's the traditional training, the Gurukula type training, which I can't say I've enjoyed really. I've had sort of components of that, where as a young person you would first study in Sanskrit and memorize many of the spiritual texts, and then when you were proficient in that, then make your way to start studying the Ayurveda texts. So even before you start to apply that knowledge, you're memorizing it. And I mean, nowadays you and I have Google, and we can debate about how what that's done to the human brain.
I know,
it's given us access to
outside brain
resources. Yeah, but now we all have this external hard drive, and many of us are hard pressed to kind of like come up with information just on our own. Especially young people, you ask them and you share an opinion, and they're just like, they got to fact check you on Google, and then they think they think they know the answer simply because Google spits out a response. So, you would memorize these texts, and then you would have them in your own personal database. So you'd be in clinic, and then the patient would present with a certain issue, and it would trigger a memory. Oh, right, this is in the sloka and sushruta in the section under kushta, skin disease, and it said this. And then you can recite that. that's amazing. And especially when you think about how much content they would have had to memorize.
Oh God, yeah.
They were amazing scholars, and that's, you know, it's a complete dedication of your life to this. And you know, just like the young Brahmin boys who spend much of their waking hours just through this Memnonic tradition, just memorizing these sacred texts, just to maintain that oral tradition, because that's, you know, originally what it was. It wasn't written down. It was passed on from teacher to student.
Yeah, Haridas once called me to task because I was invited to be a speaker in Berkeley at an Ayurvedic conference. And for some reason, I took off on one of my rants and saying how Ayurveda, you know, one of the biggest faults with it is it attached itself very quickly to the yogic practices of North America. And consequently, it adapted. First of all, it uses really small doses, and everybody thinks that it's so pure and clean and wonderful. And my experience in India is that Ayurveda is the most earthy medicine I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's unfortunate it's been so closely allied. It's you know, it's sort of been a circular process where, you know, yoga, you know, around the, you know, early 1900s was influenced by the European athletic fitness tradition, you know, calisthenics, and dramatically influenced the practice of yoga. And then you had like yoga teachers like Krishnamacharya and Iyengar and Patabi Joyce, who practiced this very athletic form of yoga, which really wasn't how it was practiced traditionally. You know, exported that to the West, and then people learned this tradition, and then it went back to India and then became integrated into the mainstream culture. So, you know, even though you're right, Ayurveda is part of this very earthy tradition that is not just exclusively oriented towards the brahmacharya, the spiritual people, but to the grahasta, the householder tradition. You know, it's grandmas, it's moms, it's dads, it's kids, you know, just practicing this real medicine. And increasingly it's become, you know, more associated with this kind of lofty spiritual tradition of yoga. And you're right, it's diminished its effectiveness in many respects because it requires you to accept all these other preconditions, like, for example, vegetarianism. You know, the original Hatha yoga tradition, it's recommended that you be vegetarian. But let's face it, that yoga tradition isn't meant to be applied to most people. It's for the sannyasi. It is for this someone who at a certain stage of their life have given up the regular burdens of being a householder, have acquired this tradition for their own spiritual development. But that's a very narrow segment of the population. And if we tie necessarily Ayurveda to this tradition, then we lose out on all that wonderful earthy tradition, which is, you and I both have like an intimate experience of, is just so practical. And, you know, Ayurveda, for example, is not a vegetarian tradition. I know you and I have debated this, talked about this many times.
Oh, I agree.
That even when you consult the classical texts, there's copious reference to the use of meat.
And meat soup and things like
meat
that.
Soup, manzarasa is almost every condition, you know, you use meat soup at some point in the treatment regimen.
And when somebody's deficient, that's what they need. They need first-class protein. However, in my talk, I think I stepped on everybody's toes. You may not agree with one thing I said there. I said, you know, the difference between Ayurveda and Chinese medicine is Chinese medicine, as much as one might criticize it, went through a purification process when Mao Zedong decided to strip away all the spiritual and psychological and things associated with Chinese medicine and get down to the bare bones of the herbs and the practice of but Ayurveda never went through that process. And then I talked about meat being included, and of course everybody there was vegetarian, and then people were standing up and screaming and yelling at me, and so
I imagine, yeah.
And afterwards, individuals would come over like, "Thank you, you said something I really have been feeling and thinking." Anyway, my teacher called me to task about that, which on a very good basis, I think, which he says that Ayurveda is part of the Vedas. And it is a spiritual tradition, and I agree completely with that. It's just that the way the spiritual tradition of yoga and Ayurveda is practiced in the West has become so sanitized and so associated with a whole kind of upper middle class kind of practice, people who can afford these kinds of indulgences and lifestyles and so forth. That I think it's not the way Ayurveda, as I see it in India, where people have triphala in their house and call it the mother of the mother and use herbs. Well, you know, like for instance, the way Ayurveda uses a lot of powders, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when I was in the village, the villagers, what they would do is they smear a little honey on their hand and mix the herbs with it and just lick it off. That's how they would take it.
Right.
So anyway, I'm talking too much here. We want to hear more from you, and so I know that I'd like.
Well, you were asking me about like the sort of interconnections between these different traditions and Chinese medicine specifically,
Right.
And you know, like my knowledge of Chinese medicine is nowhere near attains what I understand about Ayurveda, and I'm still learning about Chinese medicine, and there also is a language barrier, and I really respect colleagues of mine that are Westerners that have gone to China and just immerse themselves in the tradition, speak Mandarin, and pour through those classical texts, and you know, people like Thomas, you know, one of your students who
Right.
went to China and he's just really immersed himself in that tradition.
Yeah.
And there's if you look at Chinese medicine in terms of its structure, this is viewed from the lens of Ayurveda, you can see that some of the concepts of Chinese medicine, such as the triple burner, the San Jiao, are remarkably similar to some Ayurveda concepts. You know, anyone who studies Ayurveda understands that the doshas has different seats in the body. There's kapha in the upper region, pitta in the middle, and then vata in the lower sthana. And it very much matches the concept of the triple burner, the San Jiao. And when you look at the different attributes of those two different systems, you see a lot of similarities and connections between them. And so it does suggest that maybe there was early on some migration of ideas or intermingling of ideas. And of course, one of the probably the most relevant areas of connection is in the practice of herbal medicine, in the sense that there are many herbs that are used in Chinese medicine that are also used in Ayurveda. And
Yeah.
if you just sort of if you look at those different herbs and you do these sort of comparative analyses, you can see that they have remarkably similar understandings of how to use these herbs, but also some slight differences as well, or different orientations or different focus. And so that's always kind of interesting, because each system too has something unique to say about how to use those herbs. And that's the value of being a planetary herbalist, is that you just open yourself up to more information and more possibility, and more in different contexts. And that just expands your repertoire and your skill, I think, as a practitioner.
Exactly. And I think about the use of, well, first of all, I from what I've been able to study, Ayurveda is the mother of all traditional medicine.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it is.
I think it traveled to Tibet, and from Tibet it filtered down into China, and then it got on the Silk Road, and it got all the way to Greece, where it's actually called Unani medicine in Mediterranean. Unani means Grecian, and that's based on the humors, and then it worked its way into the Arabic systems afterwards. I believe that Ayurveda is the mother of all of the healing systems, and my personal feeling is that there's a wealth of information in Ayurveda that I am personally only beginning to tap on. Even though I spent a lifetime working with things, but as I understand it more and more and pull out certain herbs, it's incredible things that the treasures that are in Ayurvedic medicine and Ayurvedic herbs. So
absolutely, and there might have been some migration of Ayurveda from Southeast Asia as well, because the early Tamils were seafarers, and they headed east and they colonized like Sumatra and parts of Indonesia. You know, a lot of the traditional systems of medicine of like Burma and Thailand and Southeast Asia are heavily influenced by India and Ayurveda. You can even just see it in their cultural traditions. that they got a strong kind of Hindu influence. In fact, many of them were Hindus before they were, before their cultures were changed or modified. So there's been a lot of intermingling and sharing. The Tibetan root is one root as well. And, we also know that there were Indians that traveled west, that traveled to modern day Iran and Greece, and probably around the time of Hippocrates, and was sharing knowledge and information. Those were all trading routes. It wasn't like the world was all segmented and separated like sometimes we're taught in history. There was a lot more free flow of information, I think. I mean, even, Jesus was said to be influenced by Buddhism, and I think that's kind of evident in some of those teachings. So clearly there was a lot of intermingling. And, whether or not Ayurveda itself is the mother, and maybe I might think of it as like the great aunt, but they're all connected, and Ayurveda is very close to that root.
Right.
And, and has been sharing its information with the West. I mean, the Arabs actually brought a lot of Ayurveda to the West. And a lot of herbs, the trade winds that from Saudi Arabia to the Malabar coast of India, those favorable trade winds, they would sail to India and gather all those wonderful herbs and spices that were so exotic, and then travel back to the Mediterranean and make up fantastic stories about how they had to climb up these mountains and steal the cinnamon sticks from the nests of these giant, man-eating birds called the rocks, and just make up all these stories, and just to add value to their product. But the Egyptians were using Indian cinnamon in their embalming materials.
That's right.
Years ago.
Yeah.
So, there's been an intermingling and connection between these cultures for a very long time.
Right. So, talking about some specific things in Ayurveda, what I'm most interested in is lately has been Guggulu and all the different Guggulu preparations. As I understand it, there are certain terms like Ama in Ayurveda, and it always is curious to me because Ama in Italian means love.
Yeah.
And Ama is anything but love in Ayurveda. It's basically the death.
Well, in that way, it's kind of like it is love in the sense that it's got all the properties of kapha, and kapha literally means, it comes from a root word in Sanskrit called slishma, and slishma means to embrace. So this is the quality of kapha. It means to embrace. I mean, all the body is constructed of this kapha quality that binds it together, that lubricates it, that gives it this kind of physical grounded structure. And Ama is basically a physical form of kapha that becomes deranged, in the sense that instead of producing healthy tissues, you produce this waste instead. So, like when we're feeling sad or lonely, maybe we eat some ice cream or something like that, and it's sweet. It makes us feel temporarily loving or loved. Right. But then, of course, it produces Ama. So you could say Ama is connected to love in that way. And maybe a lot of what we call love, this kind of very highly preferential form of romantic love that we have in the West, has some sort of toxic elements to it, doesn't it? Like it's not the universal love that Ayurveda talks about. It's this very form of preferential divisive form of love that creates separation as much as it creates connection.
Yeah, one of the things about Sanskrit words is that they seem to come the closest where the sound of the word represents the thing that's being spoken about. And shleshma, the word shleshma,
yeah,
does it all.
Yeah, doesn't it? Yeah.
Shleshy, shleshma,
yeah. Give me a shleshma.
So anyway, there are many ways of getting rid of Ama, and sometimes it's so commonly used in Ayurvedic terms because it basically means a deep level of toxicity, and I don't know if anybody would identify particularly what toxins are, but evidently they're associated with the nervous system, or they affect the nervous system.
It means undigested food is what it means.
Digested food, right?
But so
that's phlegm in Chinese medicine.
Right. Yeah, it's very similar to that concept. When you see phlegm in
Chinese medicine, it's considered to be the hardest thing to get rid of.
It's Ama. I see them as
Ama.
equivalent. Yeah. There's a significant overlap between those concepts. So, but the sort of holographic model that Ayurveda applies, that when we say that Ama represents undigested food, obviously that refers to the actual food that you eat that doesn't get properly combusted and processed.
Right.
But on a cellular level, there's nutrients moving into the cell, and do they get properly digested and metabolized? And if they don't, then that also produces this detritus or Ama. So Ama occurs on the sort of gross macro level in our digestion, but also on this microcosmic level affecting the cellular metabolism. So in that way, Ama is a concept that extends from the gross, the obvious, all the way to the very subtle and slightly almost indistinct. So we can apply this model to mean the sort of metabolic detritus or waste, in the sense that the cells aren't able to properly digest the nutrition and produce these auto-generated toxins, which then essentially just plug up or impair the normal homeostatic physiological state of those cells, and then starts driving pathological changes that you observe and name as per the doshas. So for example, when you think of the doshas, people often think of them as being like specific things, like kapha is phlegm, pitta is bile, vata is wind or gas, but they also represent transition and change over time, and how they apply to our lives, to the seasons of the year, to the times of the day, but also different stages of disease. So the kapha phase of disease represents a congested phase. It's right. The sort of initial prodromal phase, and because it relates to Ama, when the body has Ama, it wants to remove it. And so so Agni, the digestive fire, is driven from its amasya, from its center to the periphery, so it can eat and combust that Ama. So it basically directs an inflammatory process, a cooking process, to break down and remove that Ama. We call that inflammation. And of course, if the Ama is continually generated, then you're driving that inflammatory process, and then it becomes chronic. And when you have chronic inflammation, it leads to the third stage, the third dosha, which is vata, which is synonymous with degeneration. So you have these three different phases of disease: congestion, inflammation, and degeneration, which are pretty obvious. We can see that in any tradition. You could name that in Chinese medicine or Western, the medical tradition, right. But in Ayurveda are encapsulated by these terms also of kapha, pitta, and vata, and how you can sort of stage the progression of diseases very simply just by applying the doshas.
The doshas actually mean fault, and the inference there, as far as I ascertain, is that the body needs its faults, and basically where a lot of our identity is based upon what some people would consider to be faults, because it's a unique part of us. And so the balance of the doshas, if they were completely balanced, would be invisible. So
right, they wouldn't be doshas. Dosha, yeah, it means blemish or something which is subject to disturbance. So the only way to achieve that state would be to somehow remove yourself from the function of quantum entanglement, and achieve the sort of godlike state, where you weren't interacting with the temporal nature of reality. But because we exist in this changing universe, there's no state of being that is not subject to impermanence and decay. This is what the doshas represent. They're a state of transition between health and disease.
Right.
So that's why, Deepak Chopra came out with this super annoying book on Ayurveda several years ago called Perfect Health. And it just, I hated it so much, because it just, once again, is sort of what you were saying about this idealism of yoga, that you could create this yoga deha, this yoga body of physical perfections. Yeah. It's not true, because none of us can achieve that. But moreover, Ayurveda doesn't advocate for perfection, because it says that there's no way you could exist in a state of perfection, because you have to deal with continuous change. And as soon as you think you are perfect, it's kind of like the stock market. As soon as you think all the stocks are going up, you're going to lose all your money, right? You got to anticipate the change that's going to happen. And so that's the beauty of the doshas, is that they allow us to see the universe in a state of transition.
and the imbalances of that are manifested are unique to each individual, and they're both constitutional as well as pathological when they become excessive.
Right.
And I believe the imbalances are, like, for instance, people who have to go out and dig ditches and so forth, they're going to be more, they should be more kapha.
They hopefully are. Although if you go to India and you look at the,
I know those people.
the class of people that dig ditches, they are the lower echelons of society.
Right.
And when looking at the subject of constitution in Ayurveda, traditionally, you ascribe certain fates to people that have different constitutions. So people that were naturally kapha, they were wealthy, they were beneficent, they were generous, they were wise. We know the pitta quality, but the vata were people who were thieves, they were unreliable, they were untrustworthy, they're noisy and loud. And when you look at like the underclass of people that are forced to do physical labor in India, they're all really skinny, they're not getting adequate nutrition.
Pathologically vata.
Yeah, but constitutionally, it's almost like what that's done. It's sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of having this sort of stratification within society that, the being a vata constitution is kind of unfortunate, but it's also that if you're unfortunate, you're probably kind of vata, and you're just passing those traits on to succeeding generations.
So skipping back to Ama again, the object of Ayurveda is purification. So the most important thing to purify, especially for chronic disease, is to clear Ama. And of course, many herbs in Ayurveda clear Ama, but as I understand it, Guggulu is the supreme herb for that purpose.
Guggulu is pretty helpful for that. And, I use it quite a bit in my practice, especially because I use the...
But you qualified that pretty useful. So you must have a different opinion, which I appreciate hearing.
Well, okay, so I love Guggulu, but let's face it, it's a little threatened, right? And like, we're going to run out of Guggulu if we don't stop using it.
Can we use myrrh instead?
Well, they're not the same thing. I mean, I don't have as much experience with myrrh. I mean, I did use myrrh early on in my practice because it's used in the Western herbal tradition. But, as I sort of moved more into using Ayurveda, I used more of the Guggulu. Myrrh is more of a pleasant perfume, aromatic herb. I mean, it's what you would be burning as incense. It's got quite a nice scent, whereas Guggulu doesn't have as nice of a scent. And also it's the range where it grows is a little different. Myrrh is more Northern Africa,
right,
the Middle East, whereas the Guggulu is more like, Afghanistan, Northwestern India. So that's their native Kamafora that they use primarily. There's definitely overlap between them. And I'm sure you could use them, substitute them. But I don't know what type of
interesting thing that I learned from a colleague of mine. I wish I could remember his name because he's really a outstanding herbalist who makes a lot of medicines. And he said the difference between myrrh and Guggulu, the main difference is that Guggulu has properties that are water soluble that myrrh does not have. And so because Guggulu is extracted in water. In water, and actually, I think, hate to say it, but cow's urine also.
Well, we use just water. You can just use water to extract it. Yeah.
And the gross parts of that resin are discarded.
You're right. The lipid soluble components are just saved and used as incense.
So that's
kind of interesting.
But the similarity is that myrrh and Guggulu are used the same in Chinese and Ayurvedic in terms of treating rheumatic conditions in the body.
Right.
As well as boswellia and frankincense.
Yep.
And so I'm not saying that we can use myrrh as a substitute for Guggulu, but I find that there's so many different Guggulu formulas. One could practically create an entire Ayurvedic practice learning to discriminate between the different Guggulu compounds that one would use. Yogaraj Guggulu, as an example, Kaishori Guggulu, and Triphala Guggulu. I use those things quite often, but there are many others. And the Guggulu is also a carrier and it promotes circulation, both
Yep.
probably both blood and qi.
Mm-hmm.
And so the combination with other herbs helps to direct the property of those herbs to the problematic areas of the body.
Mm-hmm.
Do you use much Google yourself, or do you have access to it?
Yeah, I use it a lot, and I use it primarily in those Guggulus. Like I can show you, for example, I've got some here. So I get, this is Yogaraj Guggulu. So there's like these little hand-rolled pills, which I don't know if you can see here. So these are traditional, they're called Gutika or Vati, and they're
I've never seen it in that form.
This is the original form. This is how they're made. When I take students to Nepal, we show them how to make some of these formulas. Like we last time we were there, we showed them how to purify the Guggulu in water and the methods, and then prepare from that the Kaishor Guggulu.
Well, if you ever do that again, be sure to let us know. I want to emphasize it to our students.
And this is Chandraprabha. So it's got a lot of Shilajit or Shilajit in it.
Right. Wow.
The main excipient is the Guggul.
Right.
So it's basically both a medicine, and it's also serves for these types of medicines as an excipient. And like, I use these a lot in my practice.
How would you give that?
I would give 2 pills twice daily.
They just swallow it, or
chew them up a little bit, or swallow it.
Chew it.
And like, I'm definitely not one of those low dose herbalists, right? Like, I know there are some herbalists that put drops on their wrist and stuff, and that's
I know.
I've never been into that. I tried it early on, and I never saw any results from it. It seemed like
David and Winston and I both commented about that in our last.
Yeah. So I usually like to give medicines in pretty high doses to see clinical effects. However, these medicines are so concentrated that all I need to do is just give 2 of those pills twice daily to get a really good clinical result. So they're super concentrated, and they're like the best form of medicine that I've found in terms of a busy practice. Because I like to formulate things for sure, but if you're formulating compounded formulas,
absolutely,
you go into dispensary, I'll see you in 20 minutes kind of thing, because I make all these things up. But these things, I can weigh them out, dispense them, and they take them, and they get really good results. Like
really good, yeah.
Yeah, and better than a lot of the things that I could ever compound, that's for sure.
Now, presumably, anybody who watches this interview is not going to go out and do a big run on Google, because Google is threatened.
It is threatened, yeah.
But
so
why we started out being a little hesitant wanting to talk about it. But
yeah,
on the other hand, when I have anybody with any kind of arthritic pain, back pain, knee pain, elbow pain, whatever, a Google compound with other herbs added, like the Yogaraj Guggulu has, and Triphala Guggulu, knee pains, elbow pains, wrist pains. Usually, taking the Guggulu formula is cleared up practically within a week.
Absolutely, that's been my experience too.
Absolutely amazing formula, and I know it's being cultivated, but it's also slow growing.
Yeah, I guess I've been sort of little concerned with like how it's become popular for the treatment of cardiovascular issues, and
such a mistake.
Using Google steroids. Well, because we know that the solution to cardiovascular disease isn't taking a medication. It's figuring out your diet and getting enough exercise and addressing nutrient deficiencies, and the intelligent use of some herbs. But by no means do we need to be using Google for that.
Yeah, and its effects on that level, to me, are not strong enough to justify using.
No, I mean, lots of things reduce hypolipidemia. I mean, you don't need Google for that. Right. But you're right, for something like arthritic pain, I routinely prescribe Yogaraj and Kaishor Guggulu, and you're right, like usually within a couple weeks, people are like, wow, I don't have any more pain anymore. Exactly. Had patients with frozen shoulder that were going to get surgery in a few weeks, get a shoulder replacement, put them on a protocol, and they end up canceling 2 weeks later because they got like full range of movement again. And that's without, seeing any physical therapist. that's just some dietary stuff and using these medications. So they're quite remarkable. And number one, I'm a little worried about having future access, but also I get them from my colleagues in Nepal. And we're also seeing what's happening in Nepal is everywhere in the world is that there is just this precipitous loss of these traditions.
Right.
We're basically one generation away from it disappearing entirely. So all of my colleagues, they're a little older than me in Nepal, but I don't know if like in 10, 15 years, if I'll be able to get these medicines. Like, I'm not sure, because I don't think anyone's going to be making them. Like we're bearing witness to the end of these traditions.
Well, there's two ways of thinking about that, and one is to use less, not tell people about it. The other is to use more so that people will be more motivated to grow it and to make it accessible. The Native American tradition is basically whenever they look at a plant, the first thing they say is, "What's it good for?" That's what they say, and the idea of limiting the use of herbs because they're endangered, I think it can be a danger in itself, because plants do not survive in a sequestered, protected environment. That environment is ultimately going to be taken over by a corporation. The Chinese knew that a long time ago, and that's why they put their herbs under cultivation. And we need to do the same with the Western herbs, and India is starting to get on board with cultivating more of their herbs, which is a good sign. So another herb that I'm interested in is Haritaki. What's the Emblica something? Chibula.
Terminalia chibula, yeah.
Chibula.
Yeah.
That's an interesting herb to me because, of course, it's one of the 3 herbs of Triphala, but it's also an herb that the medicine Buddha of Tibet holds in his hands. He holds the seed Chibula. The
first medicine, yeah.
And in Ayurveda, as I understand it, it's the most laxative of the 3 herbs used in and I'm asking you to confirm or deny that, by the way, in Triphala. And
well, it was also used in Chinese medicine, right?
Also is used differently. It's used as an astringent, which is really an interesting thing to me. Why is it an astringent in Chinese medicine and a laxative in Ayurvedic medicine? How is that?
It's explainable because it's understood in Ayurveda as well that, as far as I know, like most Chinese preparations make use of decoctions. Not all of them, but I would say most. When you go to a Chinese herbalist, you're mostly getting a group of herbs that you're going to decoct. And if you take Haritaki and you decoct it, in Ayurveda, you make it what's called grahi. Grahi means it develops an astringing property. So if you if you apply Haritaki without applying this decoction process and you just grind it up and use it as a powder, it is it is bednite, is a laxative.
Let's say that again, because that's a real good piece for me.
Yeah, so using as a powder, like Haritaki is a laxative. If you prepare it as a decoction, it is astringing.
Wow, okay.
And I've definitely used it for that. And people need to be aware, like, so for example, people might get some Triphala and they're like, oh, I'm going to take this. I heard it's good. I got constipation. And so they make a tea of it. Now, I would be the first to admit that a tea of Haritaki or of Triphala is like pretty bad. Yeah. But nonetheless, let's say you did that. Let's say you took a teaspoon of the Triphala and you poured boiling water over top of it, then you cooled it down and then you drank that. It'll have the opposite effect. It's gonna bung you up. It's gonna astringe you. Okay. So you got to make sure you don't use heat when you're preparing Haritaki if you want that laxative property, and you don't infuse it for very long. You can just mix it with water and then consume it like that, or you can use it in cold water and infuse it and then consume it like that.
So one of the most popular herbs is ashwagandha, and I also think it's subject to a lot of misunderstanding in popular culture. I don't know if I ever told you about my introducing ashwagandha in the West.
I think you've been one of the notable be able to
Well,
do so,
the
right?
way I did it, you know, I didn't even know what triphala was when I first started putting it. I knew it was good as a bowel cleanser, and I put it out as an alternative to Dr. Christopher's lower bowel tonic, which happens to be a good idea.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Later on, over the years, I learned more and more how important triphala really was to the whole system of Ayurveda.
Mhm.
And now it's the top selling herb in our line
Oh,
by
wow.
far. And however, ashwagandha was one of the other ones that Haridas pointed out, and it was pretty much unknown in the popular market. And when I visited India, I stayed in a village for a few days with a man, and we'd take a walk from one location to the next. He'd point down in a ditch. I said, "Well, there's ashwagandha down there, you know."
Hmm.
And I immediately got really excited, and I jumped down. I grabbed a bunch of these little red berries, and I smuggled it in my luggage, and I brought it back to my school in Santa Cruz.
Nice.
It happened to really love that place.
I bet.
And I planted it, and it kept coming up for a few years over and over. It volunteered itself.
Nice.
And gradually, ashwagandha has grown to be one of the most important herbs in the herb market these days. And it's an interesting herb because they say Withania somnifera. Somnifera suggests it's used for insomnia.
Yep.
But I haven't found it to be that effective for insomnia. And some of my herbalist friends say, well, it really works. You got to do that. So what's your thoughts about that? And it's also supposed to be a great energy tonic, like a chi tonic, Indian ginseng, they call it.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, what herbs, first of all, are really good for insomnia? I mean, if someone has really bad insomnia, it's more of a psychological disorder. You know, it's more about the fear and anxiety of not sleeping that usually just perpetuates this pattern of just not sleeping. So I usually found the best way to address insomnia is to get people to stop worrying about their insomnia, realize that they probably will sleep at some point, and just start, you know, sort of like fake it until you make it kind of thing, you know, like tell yourself you're a good sleeper, give yourself, like, you know, lots of positive encouragement. Because I mean, sleeping, it's literally vegetating. It's like it's about doing less, not more. And that's the problem with insomniacs, is that they'll do everything under the sun to try to get some sleep. So what works for insomnia? I mean, if there's something that's stronger than ashwagandha, then you're talking about like a drug-like effect. I know you talked about like Kratom, for example, and I use that in my practice as well.
Oh, you do? Man, that has got to be one of the most incredibly important herbs in the world.
It's pretty useful. It's pretty useful, but you
I
know,
had a patient yesterday with chronic acute pain in his legs and feet, and he's seen neurologists and so forth. And I said, well, you know, let me give you a teaspoon of this horrible tasting stuff. And he took a teaspoon of the green kratom, and within 20-30 minutes, he could take walks. He was in heaven. He couldn't believe the fact that it works in 20 to 30 minutes.
It's yeah. So I mean, there's herbs like that are almost like drugs in the sense that they're very powerful. And you know, you probably know with Kratom there are some potential dependency issues. Actually,
I've never seen that, and I've really gotten very deeply into it. I know of it.
Well, it might be like the dosage you're using. Like it was kind of interesting about that herbs is that it has different properties at lower dosage than it has at higher dosage. So the lower dosage has those analgesic effects, but it almost has like psychostimulant, mood enhancing properties, and are pretty effective for issues like attention deficit. But if you start prescribing in higher doses, like say, you know, several teaspoons, it's got a very strong, you know, analgesic sedating effect. And just like, you know, you see this epidemic in the States, you buy something at the local store, and the cashier, she's handing change back to you. She's like, because she's, you know, they're on.
Yeah, well, what I've seen is the standard entry dose for Kratom is a teaspoon of the powder. You can do that twice a day because the analgesic effect lasts for 6 to 7 hours. But I've seen some people who needed 3 teaspoons and it didn't cause a problem.
Yeah, and
but I think what I've seen when I look online is people who are addicted are talking about taking 3 and 4 tablespoons.
Exactly.
And those are addicts in the first place.
Yeah,
and you use it like an addict would.
Yeah, exactly. And they're often coming off of synthetic opiates as well. So they're using it to transition to something that's more natural. But anyway, just the point was like, what is ashwagandha effective for insomnia? I mean, it's not going to be something like effective like Kratom. It's not going to have that strong sedating properties when taken in
Oh,
high doses.
right.
I would say it's hypnotic effect is probably similar to that of valerian. In fact, has some similar constituents.
Huh.
So and because valerian, I mean, it also can be hit or miss, right? Like it's good for like occasional insomnia, but if someone's a confirmed insomniac, usually valerian stops working after a while. They
Right.
might get 2 or 3 weeks and then it doesn't work anymore. And that's kind of the pattern with insomnia anyway, because it's not caused because they're not taking X herb. It's because they've got this ongoing psychological issue that they need to address. So occasional insomnia, ashwagandha is effective for that. At least it's accommodative, it's relaxing, it helps to sort of stop the mind from spinning around. I know I've taken it for that purpose. When I've had some difficulty sleeping, I would take maybe like a tablespoon decocted in milk. The milk also has some additional
Right.
hypnotic properties, and then consume that. And it never put me to sleep, but it definitely calmed my brain down so that sleep could come a lot more easily.
And what dose of ashwagandha would you prescribe for most on an average basis for most
Well,
people?
well, for insomnia, that was pretty high doses. That was like upwards of a tablespoon to achieve that.
Oh, I've never taken that much, nor have I ever prescribed that much. That sounds really good. So that's one of the things that Todd and I really agree on is how important dose is. I know KP Kalsa is also of the same length. But when you go to most Ayurvedic doctors around the country, they practice SYA medicine called Save Your Ass medicine.
Right.
It's
Right.
and basically they try to do everything really safe and pure, and people think because it's doing nothing, it must be good for them, which is crazy enough. As far as I'm concerned, when I give somebody herbs, I want to see something happen within a week. Even if it's bad, I know how to change it then.
Yeah.
But and I know Todd and myself and KP and the better herbalists that I know are of the same mindset, that basically you want to give high enough dose so that a person can feel it. I mean, and you shouldn't have to wait months usually, maybe for complete repair or something, but to be able to notice a difference, you should feel it when you're taking enough of a dose of something within a week.
Yeah, I think there's different dosage ranges. There is that kind of very strong dose. There's also physiologic doses, which, are kind of like sub-therapeutic in some respects. And those are kind of more long-term measures. You don't necessarily know it's having a pronounced effect, but after taking it for a long time. So a good example would be like Chyawanprash. So Chyawanprash is not a formula that you can just take for a few days or a week and it's going to have any benefit. It's
Right.
clearly stated that to get the benefit of Chyawanprash, you've got to take it for like a year, right? If you take it for a year, and you're not taking like massive amounts of it, you're not taking, say, more than a tablespoon of it once or twice a day, or even a little bit less than that, you won't notice any huge effects, but you will if you take it consistently. So ashwagandha can be taken in that way as well, right? Like, but you're right. Like for ashwagandha, I'm usually prescribing it for more Vata issues, neurasthenia, you might want to call it, people with anxiety and exhaustion.
Approaching tablespoon doses. So you're not going to get that in a tincture bottle.
No, it's impractical for a tincture. Yeah.
And,
So
and you're not going to get it in pills. Even Planetary's ashwagandha is in pill form. Maybe if you're going to take 4 or 5 of those pills at one time, you might be able to get a decent dose. But the bottle says 1 pill 2 or 3 times a day. Again, that's save your ass medicine being in the marketplace.
Right. So that's to get that sedative effect. You got to take high enough doses to get the sedative effect.
Right.
But taking a few capsules of it still might help to mildly reduce anxiety. Like you might be able to take that and feel a little calmer, a little more grounded within yourself. It's pretty subtle, but I think a lot of herbs do have that. They have make it promote a difference, but it's not like herbs like cannabis or kratom that definitely have an effect that you would notice. you know. So yeah, we got a big dosage range there, but you're right. If you're trying to prescribe a sedative dose of ashwagandha, it's going to be a lot higher than is practical to be obtained within a tincture or in capsules.
So what about its effects in stimulating metabolism and tonifying qi, as one would compare it to ginseng in that respect? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's helpful for that. Those things are a little more subtle in the sense that they are usually require other interventions like diet and lifestyle, right? And then when you strip away the herbs, you know, what was the most important component? That's why I always begin with diet and lifestyle and then add the herbs on to that. I find that those usually make the biggest, most sustainable changes.
Well, I'll tell you the limit of diet and lifestyle. When
Sure.
you get to be like me at 83 years old.
Okay, you're right.
And there's a whole kind of level that most of my colleagues have not gotten into, which is geriatric herbalism.
Right.
And things are prescribed very differently, and
yes,
drugs are heaped on, and sometimes you have to take some of them. But it's remarkable how many different herbal things that you can take instead of the drugs that are routinely given to older people.
Absolutely, especially because they kind of deal with the actual problem and not just masking symptoms or even diagnostic signs.
Right.
So yeah, ashwagandha is one of those. It definitely could be a long-term herb. We'd say in the Western herbal tradition is a tropho-restorative or a rasayana, you know, and when taken in a rasayana dosage, you might not necessarily notice big effects, because anything you notice big effects to, there's, you know, as they say, a
rasayana, for everybody's sake, is basically the equivalent of a tonic in Chinese medicine.
Yeah. But you know, that's saying that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. So that's usually the problem with taking things that have strong effects. Is that, you know, there's the off time. What happens when you're not under the influence of it? You feel that much worse. So then you create dependencies and stuff. So like long-term physiologic doses that are rejuvenating with ashwagandha are like, and say for geriatric usage, I don't know if I would give it to someone and say after a week they would notice a significant effect, but after 3 months they might notice that there's less muscle wasting, they may have a little more energy, subtle things like that.
What about the use of sugar in Ayurvedic medicine, which is so important? In Shayavan Prash, so many companies, including my own, tried to put out a Shayavan Prash product, and it doesn't sell because people see sugar on the label, and they don't buy it, even though I know it's one of the most powerfully nutritious, as you would say, tropho-restorative in the vitalist tradition, compounds. I think there's close to 50 herbs in it, 40 to 50 herbs in Shayavan Prash.
Yeah, which by the way, when I take students to Nepal, people learn how to make Chyavanprash from scratch. And I don't know of anyone else that offers that level of exposure.
When are you going to Nepal again?
Well, you know, post-COVID, I'm still
right. I know.
And it's a lot of work, taking a bunch of people that many of whom have never been to developing country and then doing this like 5-week.
It's a real challenge.
Oh my God, it's a bit much. So
if I were younger, I would have done it.
Yeah, I need to retool it, but you know, it's amazing because we teach people how to make Chyavanprash, how to make the different Guggulu compounds. We even did Gudanti Basma last time, so they learned how to make Basma. So anyway, with regard to sugar, so you know, sugar is very much a venerated substance in classical Ayurveda, but let's remember the context of it, which was that if you wanted sugar, you need to go on the sugarcane fields and hack down the sugarcane with a machete, put it on your back, take it back to the village,
squeeze it out,
crush it, you know, squeeze it. You got to crush it, you know, crushing it with a giant mortar and pestle to get the juice out of it. And then you slowly cook and heat that juice from after you collected all the firewood to do that. And you reduce it, evaporate it until you get this solidified cane sugar juice that's known as gur or jaggery.
Right.
And it's golden and it looks like gold and it's treated like gold. And so when someone comes to your home or it's a wedding, you sort of minerals, you dose it out and you're like, you know, you're worthy of celebration. This is a celebratory moment. Let's have some sugar. but it was kept up on the shelf. Like it wasn't just dispensed for everyone. But in that context, Ayurveda says sugar is an amazing substance. It has so many positive benefits for the body. But now in the modern era, after we have the industrial refinement of sugar. In India, you can just go to the corner store and buy 5-pound bag of white sugar, and you can eat all of this wedding food, fried food and sugary food every single day, every single meal if you want. It's lost its context. Exactly. So Chyawanprash, if you aren't eating an otherwise sugar-laden diet, is a really good medicine. However, if you are eating those things regularly, then it's probably not the medicine for you, and maybe a sugar-free version of that or some other type of medicine would be more appropriate.
Right. Then there's the digestive wine. What's it called?
Arishta or Asava?
Arishta. What's the name? Arishta is a wine, but there's a name.
Asava? Asava is the mead. It's honey wine.
This is a grape wine.
Grape wine is draksha.
Draksha, that's it.
Yeah.
How effective do you think that is for digestion, and how would you use it?
I don't use a lot of draksha arishta in my practice. I have used it, but that's one of the things that's difficult to import from India because of breakage. The dosage is quite high on it, and so just the volume of actual stuff, it's just a bit of a headache. But when I'm in India, or when I do have access to it, I will use it. Draksha is not the one that I have like a lot of experience with. I have a little bit of experience with it. I'm more familiar with, say, like Musta Arishta, which is made with Cyperus rotundus, and another one, Kutaja Arishta, which is made with Alarena antidysenterica. Those are like two favorite remedies for like dysentery, one for acute, one for chronic. They're fantastic. They're really effective and helpful for digestive issues.
Which ones are those?
Musta Arishta, so made with Cyperus. Yeah.
Musta Arishta, and the other one is what?
Kutaja Arishta.
Kutaja.
Yeah.
Kutaja.
Yeah, Kutaja, Alarena antidysenterica.
Where can someone who's interested in getting some of that buy it? Would Banyan carry it?
No, I mean, I don't know about a lot of the stuff that Banyan carries. There many of the formulas that they offer.
Low dosage. I usually buy the bulk stuff when I get it.
Yeah. I think you're good if you buy the bulk stuff, but some of the formulas I've looked at don't, they're inspired by some of the tradition, but they're not necessarily traditional. And say something like an Arishta, I don't think they carry an Arishta or Asava. At least I don't think they do. So
you need to look online. There's Ayurvedic World or something, Planet Ayurveda.
Okay, so there's one. I mean, I don't have no affiliation with this company whatsoever. And when I bring in Ayurveda medicines, I get them from my colleagues in Nepal, and I also use a lot of Rasa Aushadha medicines, like the purified minerals. And I'll use a lot of them, but I do use some formulas, like say, I use a formula called Vata Kulantaka for atrial fibrillation. It's the best medicine I've ever used for atrial fibrillation. What's so effective. It's called Vata Kulantaka.
K-U?
Yeah, Vata, V-A-T-A, K-U-L-A-N-T-A-K-A. Vata Kulantaka. It's so effective for AFib.
I've met many people who have atrial fibrillation, and I had it briefly, and I was able to cure myself with it. And it's not something that necessarily stays with everybody, but it's a very common thing. And I even know some of my herbalist colleagues now that are getting older who have atrial fibrillation, and also people who have had COVID, oftentimes wind up with atrial fibrillation, and it can be difficult to get rid of. So it's a nervous system medicine. So what it does is it brings down Vata. So it's part of the sort of this ascending quality of Vata that rises and attacks the heart. So Vata Kulantaka is also a medicine for psychosis and for mental disorders, but it has this property of just calming Vata, reducing Vata-related hypertension and AFib. It's pretty effective. I don't know how I got on that subject. You were asking me about like where to get some of these medicines. So there's one company called Ayurveda Bay. .com, I think, and they're an Indian company that will ship internationally, and you can get like there's a couple companies. I don't like to order from big companies in India generally,
but there's a couple of companies like, say, Ayurveda from Kottayam in Kerala, and also Nagarjuna. I like to order from them because they're usually like organic and they're authentically prepared. So Ayurveda is well known. It's the most famous Ayurveda institution in Kerala. They've got, really big hospitals there. They've got clinics and pharmacies all over Kerala.
So are things expensive from those places? And
No, they're not. No, it's Indian pricing. You just got to pay for the shipping.
And how long does it take for you
Pretty quick.
Really?
Yep. The big thing you need to be aware of is the packaging is Indian, so it's a little crappy. Like,
so this, if you get nothing more from this interview with Todd Caldecott, sources for quality Ayurvedic medicine, which is very, very difficult to figure out in North America. And he's given now 3 that I didn't know about. Nagarjuna
and Ayurveda.
Nagar, Nagar.
Yeah, Juna. Now they won't. That company doesn't ship, as far as I know, directly to North America, but through the Ayurveda Bay website, they will ship it. And as I said, the quality of the packaging is not Western standard. Like, so expect labels falling off and slightly misprinted and, the wrong angle. And,
all about that.
It looks like someone picked it up and fell off the truck, and, it just doesn't look, but the quality of the product is usually pretty good. I will also say that if I use a lot of Ayurveda oils in my practice, like I'm a big fan of Abhyanga as a therapeutic modality. So
and I get means oiling.
Yeah, it's like a full body oil massage, and of course, there's many different types of subsets of that. Like you can do Shirodhara, the stream of oil in the forehead, the Shirovasti, which is like basically it's a head enema is what it means. Right. But it's using this leather band, and then you apply the oil inside that, and it kind of soaks on the top of the head. So I get those oils from a Canadian company that also ships in the States called Sewanti. So it's Sewanti, Sewanti.com. And they have some products like they've got some organic churna, and they've also got some like encapsulated products.
So
and then
churna, for everybody's information, means powders.
Powder, yeah.
Powders are the most common way that Ayurvedic herbs are taken.
Yeah. And then they've also got some of these medicated oils. So like Mahanarayana Thaila is a fantastic oil we were talking about joint inflammation and arthritis. It's such an effective remedy for that. They've got Murivena Thaila, which is effective for sports injury
So how would you use these oils? As far as I understand it, they're pretty liberally layered on.
Yeah. So I also bought some.
Take a little oil and you just rub it over, and it's supposed to work.
Generous amounts. Like I don't know if you can tell. I was noticing that, I'm 53, and so I was like, oh, am I thinning on top? I don't know. So I ordered some Bringaraj Thaila, and you probably know Bringaraj because it's also used in Chinese medicine. What?
Yeah.
Hanlin Cao, is that it? Yeah. So I brought in some of that oil, and so I would take like 2 good handfuls of that oil and apply it in my head and rub it in, and then put on a baseball cap because of course I got greasy hair now, and then just walk around all day like that.
And I tell Mariana to dip a cloth in it and just apply it over the area and cover it up for a while. And
you can do that too, yeah. But otherwise, you're applying generous amounts, like more as opposed to less. And what I do for Abhyanga for like a full body treatment is I'll usually have the patient, if they're going to do the whole body, is like in the morning before they have their shower, is just to start with their head and work their way down their body, just get it on there and rub it in as best as possible, and then leave it on as long as they can, and then go in the shower and then rinse it off, and don't wash it off, just rinse it off as best as possible. And then when you step out of the shower, just get like an old towel, not your finest linen, and then just remove the excess, and then it leaves a sheen of oil on your skin, which it has a demonstrably impactful effect, like especially for Vata conditions. Like leaving that sheen of oil just grounds people, and all of a sudden they go from being kind of anxious and dry to being grounded and moist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the end of our session, and I'm going to show this my screen, which is the opening of your website, and I'm going to give you an opportunity, which I
Oh, thank you.
totally encourage for you to study with Todd Caldecott. I know this East-West students are going to be seeing this a lot, and I'm hoping also maybe to put it on YouTube, if you don't mind, Todd.
Oh, sure, yeah, let's do it.
And but as herbalists, we're basically, at least I am, and I'm sure Todd is, it's not a matter of money, and it's not a matter of proprietary up to a certain point. It's a matter of giving you quality people, and quality herbalists are not easy to find in the world these days, especially in North America. And Todd's one of those people that I would highly recommend anybody if they're taking courses to study with him. So here's Todd's website, and I'm going to let you talk about your programs a little bit.
There we go.
Okay, this is Todd Caldecott's school, Dogwood School of Botanical Medicine.
Yeah. So I've been teaching for a long time, and I think most herbalists do. It's a way to kind of supplement income, and also just for marketing purposes, and just genuinely passionate about the field of herbal medicine. Anyone who wants to share, wants to teach it. So I've been teaching for a long time. For a while, I was director of Wild Rose College. You might know Terry Willard, and I developed their clinical program there, and I was director of that college for a few years, and then shifted out of that, and then started this school in 2012. It's mostly been online. I offer 3 kind of core programs. One called Inside Ayurveda, which I call it an introduction to Ayurveda, but I get people that tell me they've taken a master's degree in Ayurveda, which I don't even know what that is exactly, but
right.
they enroll in my program, and they're like, wow, I'm learning stuff I never came across before. And these are even people of Indian origin as well. So I would say it's like a very advanced introduction to Ayurveda, that if you understood everything in that course, you would basically be like a master physician. So it's got like so much content. I've been working on it for such a long time. The other 2 courses I have, one is called Food as Medicine. Several years ago in my practice, I realized that if patients weren't going to make the changes in their diet, they probably weren't going to get better. And so I wrote a book called Food as Medicine, and I published that in 2011, and then developed a course based on that a short time later. And once again, especially in the field of Ayurveda, you don't really get the depth of material that you need to understand nutrition effectively, especially if your main kind of way to analyze it is like this concept of sattva, rajas, and tamas. Like, for sure, you're going to go wrong if you use that as your primary modality to understand diet. It'll just mess you up completely. So, I weave in a lot of Ayurveda, but Chinese medicine, a lot of Western clinical nutrition, a lot of my own practical experience, even a little bit from the natural hygiene movement, but agnostic in the sense that I don't have one perspective on diet. I think like you look at people and you see all these different people with all these different needs. How could you say that one diet is suitable to everybody, or even most people, apart from just removing or someone from the standard American diet, which I think we can say across the board is a disaster. But, all these different diets, like the Eat Right for Your Blood Type diet, the core of them is, don't eat the standard American diet. And then whatever you do after that, you're probably just going to get better. Right. But this is really grounded in all these different traditions, and really provides a very practical approach to nutrition that is a great way to augment anything else you're studying. Like, I have a lot of people that study Ayurveda or Western herbal medicine, even Chinese herbal medicine, and they come and they take this as an add-on to help expand their repertoire of knowledge. And then the other online program we have is called Phytomedica, which is like an advanced clinical integration program where we're integrating all these different natural medicine traditions, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, Western herbal medicine, and Unani, along with clinical science, clinical nutritional science, and Western medicine, and go through each body system and review all the different diseases contained within those systems. So those are the 3 kind of online courses. And I've got also, like I just taught a workshop on the therapeutic use of magic mushrooms, which I've been using in my practice for the last 20 years. So I use that in my practice as well. So I also have
Christopher Hobbs does also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have these like add-on programs that you can also just, add on like an extra 3 or 4 hours of training in certain subjects, like say the therapeutic use of magic mushrooms or other similar one-off kind of categories.
Well, thank you, Todd. As everybody knows, I'm representative of my own course, which is the East-West School of Planetary Herbology, and I'm recommending Todd's course as well, the Dogwood School of Botanical Medicine, and it's been a great honor to talk to you, Todd, and to present you in this format of one of the leading herbalists in North America. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. And I just want to say, you've been such an inspiration for me. I think you were the first herbalist that I came across when I was studying herbal medicine that just rang my bell. He was like, this is a guy that I want to be, that I want to learn from, that because you embodied or encapsulated that approach that was inspiring me. So thank you for all the work that you've done. It's been a great inspiration.
It's mutual. You've carried the ball even further on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
God bless. Bye.
Bye-bye.